A 50mm lens is probably the most underestimated, underutilized, and underappreciated lens for portrait photography. When I was growing up and using manual SLRs, it was almost as if the 50mm was the lens you just had to start with until you could afford something better. Something that would give you a field of view that opened up your creativity, like an 85 or a 135. People tend to also call a 50mm lens the closest to human vision, but I find this to be a little bit inaccurate as well, and sort of to diminish what you can do with a 50mm lens in your portrait studio. So basically, a 50mm wasn't and isn't considered a portrait lens. And it's easy to see why some portrait photographers, especially those who are new to the field, sort of dismiss a 50mm and feel like they need something like an 85 or a 135 or a 70-200 to create portraits. However, in this video, I want to show you why the 50mm lens has become my absolute favorite lens to use for my portrait work. In fact, I will often go to the 50mm in a complete 2-hour portrait session and use that exclusively, where I take everything from close-up headshots to full-length portraits and never once even think about changing to another lens. One of the great misconceptions in photography, and really in all art, is that when we limit the gear or resources we use, we end up limiting our creativity. However, I have found that the exact opposite is true. By limiting my focal length choice to a fixed 50mm, it actually forces me, or anyone, to think more creatively, because the self-imposed barrier that it creates will eventually help you to find new and novel ways to do work within those limitations. So one reason I love a 50mm lens is because it forces me to move my feet in order to get the shot, while giving me a fixed focal length that works really well for creating variety within the frame. One of the absolute best ways you can create more interesting portraits because of this is simply by moving around instead of just zooming in and out from one location. So when I use a 50mm in my studio, I love that it forces me to move for all of these reasons. One thing that happens by being forced to move around is that you will notice that the light changes completely from one side to the other. People are going to look different from different angles as well. And my set that I create in the studio also takes on a very different vibe depending on where I am, just related to my subject. And also, when I shoot wide open, in this context, I can blur out parts of my studio I don't want in focus and give sort of a cinematic look just here in the studio. The second thing I love about using a 50mm lens in my studio is that it will in fact distort a face if you put it super close. However, the distortion, unlike a wide-angle lens, is much more subtle, and it does look great for many faces, especially someone who has a wide face, since it will compress the sides of the face and instead of flattening it out like a 135 or even an 85mm will do. Now, you do have to be careful when you do this, since it does also widen the nose a bit. But again, all of this is pretty subtle, and it can result in a portrait that really brings out a different dimension in your subject, and even sometimes may feel a little bit uncomfortable for a different dynamic. The other reason I love using a 50mm, especially at the widest aperture for these close-up portraits, is because I will almost always shoot completely wide open in this case. And by doing this, the ears, the tip of the nose, basically everything that's not on the plane of the eyes is going to be slightly out of focus. And here's another place where I sort of find myself defying the accepted wisdom in photography, because most of us are taught to make sure never to shoot wide open to avoid what I'm actually trying to do on purpose, which is a blurry face outside of the eyes. But I absolutely love this look, and my clients love it as well. And when combined with the continuous lighting that I use, I find that shooting wide portraits like this can create a dreamy and painterly look to the images. The third thing that I love about 50mm lens, which I've already touched upon, is the fast aperture. And a 1.2 aperture will look very different if you photograph someone close as it will if you photograph them far. So by simply moving away from your subject and still shooting wide open, say for a half full-length, three-quarter portrait, the effect of the depth of field is going to be less than when shooting really close to them. So if I focus on the subject's eye that is nearest to my camera, which is what I always do, the other side of the face or the body or the background, depending on how far or close I am to them, will be less or more in focus. And I love to do this because in my work, I really only care about the eye being in sharp focus and the expression of the face. Everything else sort of is secondary to me in this style of portraiture. By keeping the eye closest to the viewer in focus, the most attention is going to be drawn there instead of on the rest of the frame or on the background. The fourth thing that I love about 50mm lens is that you can acquire one for very little money. Now, although in my studio nowadays I'm using a Canon 50mm 1.2 RF lens, which is quite expensive, you don't need a lens this expensive to create beautiful portraits similar to what I've been talking about in this video. A nifty 50mm 1.8 is going to work wonders. So one of the best reasons to use a 50mm for this portrait work is because they're incredibly affordable. You don't need to spend thousands of dollars to get a good and very fast 50mm lens. For example, the 50mm RF Canon lens, which is a 1.8 lens, can be had for $199. And this means that you can create beautiful separation between your subject and your background without breaking the bank. If you want even more bokeh and shallower depth of field in your portraits, however, you can opt for a 1.4 or a 1.2 like I mentioned, which again is the lens that I use the most in my studio. However, before upgrading to the 1.2, I was using an older Canon 50mm 1.4 EF lens, as well as the Fuji 35 1.4 for all of my portrait work, and I love both of those lenses. We photographers often spend so much time, money, and effort trying to figure out the best lens to use, the best lights to use, the best camera, the best editing software. I can go on and on and on. However, the more faces I photograph, the more I realize that we often don't need nearly as much gear as we think is necessary to do the work, and to do it at a very high level. So to conclude this video on the 50mm, I want to challenge you to dust off that nifty 50 that you haven't used in years, and challenge yourself to use it for a portrait session. Implement some of the tips I gave you in this video and see what kind of results you get. I'm sure that you're going to find that instead of stifling your creativity, the 50mm will instead force you to find new creative ways to interact with your subject and help you make images that look and feel very different than the ones you've been doing so far. And it's going to be a very different kind of look than your 85 or your 135mm, and I think you might like it. All right, everyone, well, thank you as always for joining me for this video. Here's wishing you a great day, and go out and take some awesome pictures. I will see you in the next one. Peace.